Hans, you're just some privileged guy. You're a privileged guy, Hans. You're not a real proletarian, Hans. You're privileged. You're not the real workers. You're not a real worker, Hans. You're privileged. Okay, I want to settle that whole thing once and for all. But anyway, I think we're in due order for a deep dive into the contemporary history of the Communist Party. And also I want to address several things and several allegations that are being made by Communist Party members regarding the history of the party. Regarding what Infrared is doing is that, I don't know if it's Taryn, I don't know if it's Joe Sims, I don't know if it's coming from the high up, but we're basically seeing an increase. Thank you so much, Dionysian, appreciate you, man. We're basically seeing an increase in this claim that I keep seeing go around, whether it's in the party circles or whether it's elsewhere, that we are somehow Trotskyists and we're entryist. Now, I'm going to explain to you why that's a whole lot of bullshit. It's completely unjustifiable, and it's completely unsustainable. So I want to begin this by talking about the origins of what we call Leninism, right? And because, after all, Marxism, Leninism is the so-called ideology of the current CPUSA. It's the ideology of the major communist parties around the world, whether they're in power or they're in waging insurgencies in jungles or something like that. It's Marxism, Leninism, right? And I want people to understand that there isn't a direct line from Marx to Lenin. And what I mean by that is that between Marx and Lenin, between the First International and the Third International, right, there was the Second International. So between Marx and Lenin, there's something called social democracy, which Lenin was also a part of and was participating in. In addition to that, there was a Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. That's what they called themselves, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And there was various disputes and splits and factions within this one party where, for whatever reason, Lenin's faction came out on top. Before I get into the history of the economists and the liquidators, and then before then the polemicizing with the Narodniks, which Plekhanov and Lenin himself had engaged in extensively, I want to talk about the central split, which I think is the most decisive for purposes of relevance here, which was between the Bolshevik Party and the Menshevik Party. So, in November of 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party held a convention. Thank you so much, Spartan Duke. Appreciate you.
CPUSA 2036 forever.
Very based. They held a Congress, right? It was their, it was the second Congress, I think, of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. I forget which Congress it was, right? But that was basically when the split happened between the Bolshevik Party, the majority, and the Mensheviks. And believe it or not, this is going to sound weird, right? Not a lot of people know this. It's a less known fact. The split was actually because the Mensheviks, who were inheriting the liquidators, the liquidator faction. If you don't know what the liquidator faction is, it was basically... So for a long time, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was conducting underground and illegal activities, right? And the liquidators, as soon as the opportunity arose, right, they wanted to basically shun the party's illegal history. They wanted to completely go out in the open, fully and completely, abscond upon the old party traditions, the patriarchal traditions, as I would call them, of the party, that were learned when they were fully underground, and they had to be fully underground. The liquidators basically said, you know what, we have to abandon all that old shit we used to do. Let's just completely forget about our history and the founding of the party and all the struggles we went through and all that shit. Let's just completely become allied with the liberal bourgeoisie, which we think is gaining enough headway to successfully accomplish a Russian revolution, in which case it's going to carry out the bourgeois revolution, overthrow the czar, and yada, yada, yada. So, that's basically the circumstance and the situation we're dealing with at that time. And part of that was that these factions within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, all these different people, Julius Martov, Plekhanov, and others, what they basically wanted to do, as something that's a part of that, among other things, is reduce the barrier to entry to being able to join the party. They basically said, look, this party is too restrictive. We want to lax membership requirements. We want to, I guess, decrease the extent to which our party is accessible by people. And we want the party to be able to be open to, like, you know, the working masses and the masses in general. So the people who only had trade union consciousness and the people who only kind of didn't have that much familiarity with the history of the party or Marxism for that matter, they wanted it to be open to everyone, right? But why was what the Mensheviks was doing a form of opportunism? Because that was what the Mensheviks wanted to do, whereas Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they said, no, we want to keep our strict requirements for being able to join the party. Why? It sounds like Lenin's just being a mean guy, and the Bolsheviks are just being mean, or even they're being gatekeepers, right? Why do they want strict requirements to join the party? But why were Bolsheviks being gatekeepers in this specific instance? Is it because the Bolsheviks didn't want a mass movement of the working class? Is it because they didn't want to work with the working class or anything? Is it because they're just elitists? Actually, believe it or not, the answer might surprise you. No. They just had a different requirement for membership of the party, not for the extent to which the party should be interacting with trade unions and with the working masses, but insofar as you want to actually become a member of the party, a member, you have to actually be a kind of professional revolutionary. You have to dedicate yourself to this. And part of what's going to come with that is that only the most advanced sections of the working class will be allowed to become members of the party. And it's kind of interesting because, like, I think almost everyone would unanimously be like, that's extremely elitist and classist against the workers. I mean, what, you're saying workers can't be members? And Lenin was basically responding and saying, it's not that workers can't be members, it's that workers are too busy working, right? Members of the party are going to be the people who can dedicate their life to this, who can somehow spare the ability and spare the time to dedicate their life to this. And, you know, there's a really interesting passage by Lenin where he says, here it is. So there's the specific passage I want to show you guys. Found it. So a lot of the time people LARP their personal class background in order to gain social capital and leverage when it comes to, like, you know, oh, I'm a real communist because I'm a proletarian. And I even saw this dumb fucking Twitter account that's like, I'm an actual worker. That means you have to bow before me and everything I say is correct, right? Well, don't take it from me. People always talk about this shit like, Hans, you're just some privileged guy. You're a privileged guy, Hans. You're not a real proletarian, Hans. You're privileged. You're not the real workers. You're not a real worker, Hans. You're privileged. Okay, I want to settle that whole thing once and for all to just get people to understand that a person's individual class background is completely irrelevant as far as, like, what their significance as a thinker is concerned, or as like, you can't bring it up and personalize and individualize it. And if you don't believe me, I just want you to read Lenin. Take it from Lenin and what is to be done. Since there could be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. So Lenin is saying that the working masses themselves in the process of their workers' movement can't actually formulate their own independent ideology. That's not going to actually come from the workers themselves. He says in the footnote, now this doesn't mean that workers have no part in creating such an ideology. Emphasis added here. They take part not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians. They take part only when they are able, and to the extent that they are able, more or less, to acquire the knowledge of their age and develop that knowledge. But in order that they must succeed and more often, every effort must be made to raise the level of consciousness of the workers in general. It is necessary that the workers don't confine themselves to the artificially restricted limits of literature for the workers, but that they learn in increasing degree to master general literature. How many times do people come to me and be like, Hans, can a worker understand anything you're saying, Hans? A worker wouldn't be able to understand anything you're saying, Hans. And like, as if that invalidates what I'm saying. But here's Lenin, probably the most successful revolutionary in the history of the world, spelling it out clearly, right? That's a stupid argument to make because of the division of labor between mental and physical that materially exists in society. You cannot confine yourself to the literature for workers, or even to just the experience of workers. You have to be a fully fledged, full participant in the literature and thought and consciousness of your age. You can't just say, well, worker, I mean, that's also insulting to workers because it assumes what? That they're too stupid to understand anything. I mean, but anyway, as individuals, I mean, but this is here Lenin saying it directly. Lenin is saying that when workers participate in the creation of socialist ideology, they're not doing so as workers. So what does that actually mean, right? It means there's a difference between your class background and what you're doing when it comes to your participation in the superstructure. So, for example, if let's say there's a billionaire who's a communist, right? If they're helping the communist movement, they're not doing so as a bourgeois, whatever billionaire. That just happens to be an incidental fact of their background and their life. So this is Lenin spelling this out as clear as day, right? I want you guys to take note of this and remember this. Anytime someone ever tells you that, oh, well, the workers don't agree with you, or you're not a worker, you're actually privileged, or some dumb shit like that, just go back to Lenin, right? Because he was being extremely elitist here by saying that the independent ideology is not formulated by the working masses themselves, right? Now, why am I bringing this up, and why am I saying this? Because in certain contexts, like the ones that define the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were engaging in a type of opportunism, where the only reason they wanted to open the party up to the working masses with no barrier to entry, when I say open the party up, I mean people being able to acquire membership. The only reason they wanted to do that is because that had been an environment at the time of general kind of reformist feelings among the people. There was this kind of leadership of the liberal bourgeoisie at the time of leading the reform change. So at this specific moment, the Mensheviks were like, you know what? We need to make this party less tight, less hard. We need to soften it and just kind of dissolve in civil society. The problem is that this was the civil society that was only able to have an existence so far as it conformed to the legality of the autocratic dictatorship that had existed at the time in Russia. So what the Mensheviks in reality were doing was not acting as populist, right? And by the way, they couldn't have been acting as populist because they weren't talking about opening the party to like the peasant masses, but just to the urban, workers and the trade union consciousness and stuff like that. They wanted to basically use this as an opportunity to force the party to lower itself to the kind of reformist attitudes of the workers at the time, right? So the Bolshevik-Menshevik split was actually founded upon the Bolshevik insistence, more or less, that the party remain more exclusive, right? I'm going to bring this up again. Jesus fucking Christ. I'm going to bring this up again later when we're going to deep dive into the CPUSA and talk about that, because that's what we're doing today, actually. And then we're going to get into our Twitter space and do all that. But here, right, this is a summary, Lenin's summary of the Second Congress, where he says, paragraph 1 of the rules define a party member. The given definition was, Lenin's definition, a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is one who accepts its program and who supports the party both financially and by personal participation in one of the party organizations. In place of the words I have underlined, Martov proposed work under the control and direction of one of the party organizations. Okay? So this is a really sneaky thing Martov is doing here. What Martov is saying, basically, is that you don't actually have to personally participate in the party organization to be a member of the party. You could be, for example, just a member of a trade union who's under the direction of the party, and that would allow you to be a member, right? Basically, what Martov is doing is he's harming the discipline of the party. He's harming the ability for the party to retain a hardened stance and retain that patriarchal memory of all of the hardship and struggle it had to endure in its age of going underground, Martov is engaging in this kind of liquidationism, which is what the liquidators had tried to do before, which is basically forget about all that and let's just broaden the scope of what becomes a member. But the opportunism is simple, right? Martov is here acting like he wants to be an equal member to all of these workers who aren't even participating directly in party work, because Martov already has the ability to lead trade unions and command them at will. It's almost like it's using democracy in order to retain one's elite position, right? Because if party membership is defined in the way Lenin wanted to define it, which is personal participation in one of the organizations, then all of these elites that are within the party, Martov and the rest, they can actually be challenged, right? They actually have to face their responsibility as party members. They have more accountability and responsibility. But when it becomes indistinguishable between being someone who's personally participating in the party and actually leading the party and actually directly formulating its ideology and stuff, and just some worker who's involved with working with the party or is under the control of the direction of one of the party organizations, suddenly people like Martov don't have to be as accountable as they did before. They can defer, basically, to the kind of backwardness of the worker members of the party. And by backward, I don't mean it in the sense of like culturally, I just mean it in the sense of like their kind of more reformist attitudes. So if you guys are following along with me here, right, you can see that, you know, the elitism of the Bolsheviks was actually more populistic because they wanted to actually retain people who were accountable for what they were doing, which basically means they can't hide behind the masses. They actually have to lead the masses, right? We argue that the concept of party member must be narrowed so as to separate those who worked from those who merely talked, to eliminate organizational chaos, to eliminate the monstrous and absurd possibility of there being organizations which consisted of party members, but which were not party organizations, and so on. Martov wanted to broaden the party and spoke of a broad class movement needing a broad, diffuse organization. It is amusing to note that in the defense of their views, all of their supporters cited what is to be done. Plekhanov hotly opposed Martov, pointing out that his Tsarist formulation would fling open the doors to opportunists who logged for such a position of being inside the party but outside its organization. Under the control and the direction, I said, would in practice mean nothing more nor less than without any control or direction. Martov won. His formulation was adopted. Thanks to the Bund, which of course, if you don't know what the Bund was, it was the Labor Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund, which of course sensed the loophole and brought all of its 5 votes to bear. So that was one of the definitive controversies that defined the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, okay?